there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. Hi, I'm Gemma Barth, host of True Crime Conversations, and this is the final episode of our Hot Pod Summer series. Last year, we talked to criminologist Xanthi Mallett about the case of Keli Lane, who was convicted of murdering her newborn daughter in 1996. Keli was sentenced to 13 years and 5 months in prison in 2011, but in March last year, her parole was denied because of the no body, no parole laws introduced in 2022. Since Keli's daughter Tegan has never been found, the parole board ruled that she should stay in prison simply based on those laws. Keli has always maintained her innocence, and her case has drawn comparisons to the wrongful conviction of Lindy Chamberlain. So is she guilty, or has she been wrongfully convicted, and should she be released? Have a listen to the episode and let us know what you think about this ongoing case. It's September 1996, and Keli Lane is at a wedding in Manly on Sydney's northern beaches with her boyfriend Duncan. She's wearing a white suit and she's smiling. She looks relaxed, happy, and in the moment celebrating her friend's special day. Just a few hours earlier, she'd been discharged from hospital after having her second baby, a little girl called Tegan. But no one knew. Not her boyfriend, not her parents, not her friends. They didn't even know she was pregnant. They didn't know she'd had a baby the year before too, who she gave up for adoption. But this time, there's no official adoption. According to Keli, she gave Tegan to her father to raise before heading to the wedding, a man named Andrew Norris or Morris, she's not quite sure, who she had a brief affair with. But Andrew has never been found. Neither has baby Tegan. It wasn't until Keli had a third child, another secret pregnancy, and another baby she gave up for adoption, that a docks worker started digging. He could account for her first child, but where was Tegan?
Did you kill the child?
No, I did not. I did not do anything like that.
Someone else.
No.
A jury decided otherwise. But did they get it wrong? Keli Lane's story has been compared to the wrongful conviction of Lindy Chamberlain. It's been pulled apart and analysed for years. So is she a baby killer? Or is she a woman misunderstood? I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Keli Lane maintains her innocence. In 2018, she reached out to Australian journalist Caro Meldrum Hanna, begging her to dig into her case and her story for the ABC, to reveal what she says is the truth.
I could sit here, Caro, and do my time. I'm halfway through, but no way. I'm happy for you to go to the ends. I want you to go to the ends.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
An investigation into Tegan's disappearance began in early 2001, more than 4 years after Keli gave birth to her. In 2005, an inquest was held, and a coroner concluded that Tegan was most likely dead, referring the case to the Unsolved Homicide Squad. In November 2009, Keli Lane was charged with murder, with her trial getting underway the following year. She was found guilty, sentenced to 18 years behind bars, with a minimum parole period of 13 years. That date, May 2024, is fast approaching, but the New South Wales State Parole Authority has already knocked back her bid for release because of the no body, no parole laws that were introduced only a couple of years ago. Keli has served time in some of the state's toughest prisons. She's 48 now. She has a teenage daughter waiting for her on the outside, her fourth baby. Today's guest, criminologist Dr. Xanthi Mallett, has been in contact with Keli personally for many years. She knows this case and this story back to front. and she has a lot to say about it. Xanthi joins us now. Xanthi, tell us a little bit about your expertise and what you do for a living.
I am an associate professor of criminology. So what that in essence means is I spend a lot of my day working with students, teaching them the basics of criminology. I also spend my day doing research, and one of my areas of expertise is looking at mothers accused of murdering their children, which is actually how I originally came across the case of Keli Lane and Kath Folbig and many other high profile cases in Australia. And I do a lot of media work as well, engaging with the media, different interest topics, things that come up, big cases, helping to explain those to the public. So I have a few different hats that I wear depending on what day it is.
And you've weighed in on the Keli Lane story quite a bit in recent years. Is it a case that you still think about often?
It certainly is. So I came across the case of Keli Lane back in 2013 when I first started writing about mothers who murder in Australia. So I started writing a book, which came out in 2014, of that title, Mothers Who Murder, and Infamous Miscarriages of Justice. And so in my book in 2014, I actually raised issues of doubt that I had with Keli's case. And since that time, Keli got in touch with me, and I've been a number of times to see her since she's been incarcerated. And I've basically followed the case very closely and raised my concerns over the years. And sometimes that was an extremely unpopular thing to do, given she's well known as kind of a baby killer, same as Kath Folbig. And so I have been using my, public profile and background in forensics and criminology to just lay some groundwork into how we look at these cases and why I have concerns about the reliability of the convictions, specifically in Keli's case.
Let's tell Keli's story before we get to the conviction and everything that's happened since. Keli's story starts by the beach in Manly, the Insular Peninsula, as it's infamously called. What was her early life like?
Keli's early life was very privileged. She was part of this very elite group. It was a perfect lifestyle in essence. You know, she was hanging out at the beach all day. She was very much into water sports. She was hanging out with all the popular kids, and her family were very embedded in the community. Her father was a police officer. Her mother was a nurse, and they spent a lot of time engaged with like kids sports and supporting the family. So they were a very close-knit family and also very embedded in the community. From the outside, this appears to be a pretty idyllic lifestyle. And certainly Keli excelled at sport. She was a very good water polo player. And so this is something that was part of her lifestyle from a very early age. And she certainly went on to compete at a high level in terms of her sporting ability. And that's something that her family were very supportive of.
Did she have a close relationship with her parents growing up?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because when we get to the background of what happened with Tegan Lane, who's the child that ultimately vanished and led to Keli's conviction for murder, if you look at the family history, it's quite an unusual one in that Keli had a number of pregnancies before Tegan. She had a couple of abortions, and then she had one child that was adopted out before Tegan, and then Tegan, whom she claims she gave to the biological father. I'm sure we'll get to that. And then there was another child after that she adopted out. And so when all of this came out in court, what was interesting was that the family claimed to know nothing about all of these pregnancies. And so I always thought that was quite an interesting family dynamic. And with respect to the family and Keli, I don't kind of want to dig into that too much because that's private to them. But I always thought that it was interesting that if they'd been a close-knit family, it just surprised me that nobody was aware of these multiple pregnancies. And that's not a conversation that was had in that house, you know, because this was obviously a young woman that was going through pretty traumatic events repeatedly. And that's something that you would expect for most families to have noticed and potentially offer some support with. So how close they were is difficult to actually ascertain. Certainly from the outside, they appeared to be a very supportive, loving family who were in essence, pillars of the community.
Let's delve into that timeline you laid out a bit more. So Keli fell pregnant for the first time in 1992. She was only 17 years old and she had an abortion. She then fell pregnant again 2 years later, and again she terminated that pregnancy a bit further on in the pregnancy, about halfway. Did she
tell anyone about those experiences? If she wasn't talking to her family, was she talking to anyone?
Well, again, that's quite interesting. She was obviously playing water polo at this time. She had, you would think, quite close friends on those water polo teams. Yet again, this doesn't seem to have been a topic of conversation. There was some gossip certainly around it. Other girls seem to have recognized that she was pregnant because obviously she's in a swimsuit all the time, but even her coach doesn't seem to have raised this with her. So I'm not sure what support or whom she was talking to at that time about this, but certainly, and I hope she did have support through these abortions, because I know that they were certainly traumatic for her. This is not something she took lightly at all, but it's difficult to actually see evidence of that in terms of the people that she was nearest to and spending the most time with when she was in those late teenage years going into her 20s.
Her third pregnancy in 1995, she's still so young, she's only 19. She gives birth to that child. So she goes full term, she gives birth to a healthy baby, and again, no one seems to say anything, know that she's pregnant. This is all fresh in my mind because I gave birth last year and everyone could tell I was pregnant. How on earth did no one know or say anything?
Look, I cannot answer that question. I do not know. I don't know how your family wouldn't know. I don't know how you can go full term and people around you not know about that, not mention that, not say anything about that. I mean, her mum was attending training sessions at the pool. How do you not notice your daughter is full-term pregnant? Her boyfriend at the time, long-term boyfriend, didn't know that she was pregnant and had given birth. I can't get my head around that. I mean, you hear it occasionally, don't you, that a woman didn't know she was pregnant and suddenly gives birth and it's all a big surprise. But for this to happen multiple times, it seems a very strange scenario when everybody claims no knowledge of these babies, and yet somebody surely must have noticed some changes in Keli that would have signified that she was pregnant. It's totally out there to think that nobody knew anything.
What were the circumstances around her giving birth to that first baby? Did she do that alone? And what happened to the child?
So she gave birth to the first child in hospital, and it was in essence immediately given up for adoption. So this was a decision that was made before, obviously, she went in. She'd already decided, although she went full term, my understanding is that it was too late to actually abort in that case. She found that she was pregnant too late, therefore took it to full term. And so the next best option for her at that time, she didn't feel she was able to give that child the life she would want to. So she elected to give that child up for adoption.
And she was in the birth suite by herself?
Mm-hmm. No support. Yeah, correct. This is a young woman going through all of this alone. I mean, my heart goes out to her. I know that people have judged Keli over the years for having multiple abortions and multiple adoptions. But, you know, this is so hard emotionally for anybody to go through. I can't imagine having to go through it multiple times on your own.
Her fourth pregnancy is baby Tegan, which is the reason we're all here.
Correct.
Born in September 1996. What do we know about that pregnancy and birth? Once again, completely secret?
Completely secret. Nobody knew. Again, the boyfriend didn't know. Now, Tegan is, according to Keli, the result of an affair with an older man called Andrew Norris or Morris. And Keli's unsure of the surname. So we'll just call him Andrew for simplicity's sake. He was a married man and they began an affair. She visited him at his apartment in Sydney, etc. She fell pregnant. Again, it was my understanding that it was too late to abort, so she went full term. And Andrew had a partner called Mel. This was Keli's understanding from what he'd said. And it was decided between the biological parents that Keli wasn't in a position to raise the child. So she would give Tegan to Andrew and his partner Mel. She was on board with this. And that they would then raise the child as their own. And so Keli went into hospital again on her own, gave birth to Tegan after 2 days in hospital in Sydney. This is Keli's version of events. She met Andrew and Mel in the reception downstairs in the hospital, where she handed over Tegan, and then she got a taxi home where she got changed and went out to a wedding later. And again, nobody in her family or her boyfriend knew anything about the fact that she'd just given birth. She just went out and carried on as normal. And so that is according to Keli, the last time she saw Tegan was when she handed her over to her biological father in the hospital as a 2-day-old.
And I think it's details like what you just said, the fact that she left hospital and a few hours later went to a wedding that people struggle with. What do you say to that? Because everyone has their own kind of way of living. Most of us, after giving birth, can't imagine going to a wedding and wearing white. But, you can't judge another's experience, right?
Exactly. And Keli also, one of the children she gave birth to and then played water polo almost immediately after. So, Keli is quite a stoic, strong woman. This is something she obviously wanted to keep to herself for her own reasons. And again, I respect that. Nobody has to disclose these type of events if they don't want to. It's their private life. And so it's easy to judge and think, well, how is that possible that you could go home, get changed, go to a wedding, act like everything is normal, having just given birth and handed over your child to her father? But as you say, everyone is different. And this was obviously, it was important to Keli to keep this information private, even from those closest to her. And so she, in essence, did everything she could to keep Tegan a secret.
She gets pregnant again, and I feel like I need to ask this question. Has she spoken to you about putting things in place to stop herself from getting pregnant? Because she keeps having these traumatic experiences of having to give the baby away or having abortions. Has she talked to you about that?
So Keli was actually on birth control. Clearly it wasn't working. And she was part of a culture in those northern beaches at the time that was very heavily focused on drinking, for example. And I do wonder whether there were elements of perhaps drinking that maybe led to that birth control not being as reliable as it could have been. So perhaps sometimes pills were forgotten. We're talking about young people probably drinking too much. So she may have been sick at times. I'm just thinking about, look at that lifestyle. These people, they're out every Friday, Saturday night. It's part of their culture to drink and to socialize. And so she was attempting to prevent the pregnancies, but clearly it wasn't working.
She has a third baby, a fifth pregnancy, and she gives birth in 1999. Again, the same secrecy, like her first, like her second. What happens to that child?
So this is where it gets interesting. So this child also, she ends up at hospital without any support. And again, she gives up this child for adoption through social services. Now, why I say this is interesting, because generally people follow a pattern of behavior, and it's the easiest form of behavior for them, what they find works best. So this case never worked for me because you have 2 abortions when Keli caught the pregnancies early enough. Then you have a third pregnancy where she didn't catch it early enough, so she made a decision in the baby's and her best interest to adopt. And then the Crown would have you believe that there was a 4th child that she allegedly decided, instead of leaving at the hospital, instead of adopting out via social services, she decided instead to kill. And then the 5th child, again, goes too far in the pregnancy, but she gives up to adoption. So that's what never worked for me. Why would somebody who knows there's a process by which they can legally and ethically provide for their child, why would they, in the middle of that, decide to kill their child and then revert to plan A again afterwards and again adopt with the 5th child? This, criminologically speaking, doesn't work. This doesn't follow any behavior pattern that I recognize. There's no insinuation that at the time of Tegan's birth, Keli was suffering from any post-traumatic stress or postnatal psychosis, for example, that would lead her to really subverting her behavior that she knew would work, the plan that she knew would work, and go to such extreme lengths. Why would you do that? You could just leave the baby in the hospital and walk out. So behaviorally, it made no sense to me that she made that decision with Tegan.
Especially considering the first adoption went according to plan.
Exactly. There were no problems with that. People would have you believe that Keli was kind of this very cold, hard person and she didn't struggle through that emotionally, but she absolutely did. When you speak to her about the loss that she felt adopting out her children, that was very raw for Keli. So this was a very hard thing for her to do. And so for me to accept that somebody who suffered through giving up their child for adoption twice but in the middle has the capacity to kill a child. I just can't understand that process. Frankly, I don't see evidence for that process. So that is where I kind of came to this. I was like, there's a problem here. This does not make any kind of sense.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with forensic criminologist Dr. Xanthi Mallet about the disappearance of Tegan Lane and the conviction of her mother, Keli. Up next, we look at how police got involved in this story and the supposed evidence that saw her convicted.
How did the police become involved in this? Because the third baby is adopted out, and then that's when the police start getting involved. What happened?
Well, first of all, social services got involved. So when the adoption of the fifth child occurred, an individual who's working for social services started looking at Keli's history of adoptions and noticed that the hospital records demonstrated that there was a middle child. So we have adoption 1, then we have Tegan, and adoption 2. And then they started to look at, okay, so we know where baby 1 is, and obviously we're processing baby 3. The question is, where is baby 2? Where is Tegan? And that is where all of this started. And because social services couldn't locate baby Tegan, eventually this was reported to police, and police started to look at Tegan initially as a missing person, and obviously eventually prosecuted Keli for murdering Tegan because they failed to actually locate Tegan.
It did take quite a while because she gave birth in 1999 and she's brought in for questioning 2001. So there's a bit of time in there. Obviously, a lot of the time the justice system takes a bit of time here. So I'm sure there was lots going on there. But when she's brought in for questioning in 2001, she's pregnant again.
Mm-hmm.
Around 7 months. And this child she actually keeps. And I want to bring this up because the circumstances around this pregnancy, this child that she ends up becoming a mother to, for her, this was like a new start, wasn't it? She was about to tell her family that this was her first child.
Yes. And actually saying there was a lot of things going on in the background. I'm not even sure there was, to be honest, because if you look at Keli's demographic in terms of there's been a report to the police, we don't know where this child is. So they would have looked at Keli and her family. You know, she was still a sportswoman at this point, but she was also moving into teaching in schools and she had a job. Her life was going well and she was from a fairly affluent neighborhood. And this is not the kind of person who the police would have looked at and thought, there's a problem here. You know, has something sinister happened to this child? Because Keli just does not fit the picture of somebody who would intentionally harm or dispose of a child. So I'm not sure the police were particularly active in those early days because I don't think they really thought that Tegan had ever really been at risk because she's got this very supportive family who are well known in the community and she just doesn't fit the picture of a woman who would intentionally harm her child.
How distressed was Keli during that early questioning time? Because obviously she's being accused of something horrendous, but she was also terrified about all of the other things kind of coming out to her world, wasn't she?
Absolutely. And so initially she was being questioned looking for a missing child, remember. So it wasn't until much later in the process that they believed Tegan was actually deceased. So initially, you know, she was talking to the police almost as that witness, handing over the child. She was trying to be as helpful as possible, but obviously very concerned that all of these secrets she tried very hard to keep from her friends and her family were going to come out as part of this process. You know, her family, as I've said, they're high profile in the local community, the stand-up citizens, you know, police officer and a nurse, and very engaged locally. Everyone knows them. And she is absolutely terrified that people are going to find out about all of these secret pregnancies, including her family, remember. So yeah, she was very, very worried. And I've heard covert phone calls from slightly later in the investigation when she knows that they are looking at her in terms of Tegan having been killed. And she's talking to her mother for the first time. And at this point, her father doesn't know. And you could tell she was absolutely terrified about what would happen when all of this information came out. And it was a really hard call to listen to, actually, because you could really hear the distress that she was going through.
What was she scared would happen?
reputational damage to the family. Everyone was going to find out that she'd been keeping all of these dark secrets. And I think the family were genuinely worried about that too. You know, their standing in the community could have been at risk here, especially if she's being investigated for murder, remember, and her father's a police officer. This was going to be extremely challenging for the entire family.
Obviously, there's big lies like pregnancies and children being born, but I think one of the other things a lot of people struggle with are the little lies. The lots of little white lies that she tells amongst everything. She kind of makes up where her family is from and her parents are in Perth right now and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. So when it came out at trial, she'd made up, as you say, lots of little white lies as to why she didn't have any support people present with her, who was going to be picking her up, leaving the hospital, why there was no one there. There were lots of white lies, and a lot was made of that during the case by the Crown, indicating that basically, if somebody can be demonstrated to be a liar, and there's no doubt that Keli lied, she would openly admit that herself. It's out there for the world to see. But a line was drawn between telling lies and being able to murder a child. And again, that's not the same thing. I challenge any of the listeners to put their hands on their hearts and say they've never told a lie to keep something secret that they didn't want people to know. We all have. People lie all the time for many reasons. And when you're trying to keep a secret as big as Keli's secrets in terms of the births of the children, then I think some of her lies, you can understand why she was telling those to cover her tracks. And so, yes, I would just challenge anyone to judge her about the lies and consider whether they've ever told lies to keep their secrets hidden.
What about the lie or the accidental misnaming of Andrew? Can you tell us about that? Because you alluded to it a bit before, but what were the two scenarios where she said Norris and then later she said Morris?
Well, yeah, she wasn't entirely sure what her surname was, and I've spoken to her about this, but she's got really clear memories of what he looked like. She dated him for some time. She could describe the apartment where he lived, what it looked like, and that apartment is certainly there. The issue with the names is an interesting one because you've got to remember that I've looked for other reasons, things that might explain this. You've got to remember that this is a married man for a start. And in that scenario, she's younger than him. Is it possible that he never even told her his real name? This is an illicit affair he's trying to keep to himself. So I always wondered whether his first name probably was Andrew, because obviously you're going to respond to your name. That's a harder lie. If you start saying, oh, call me Mark, my name's Andrew, you're not going to respond to your name when people call you. So you might keep your first name, but would you, in fact, lie about your second name if you were trying to keep an affair secret?
But Xanthi, his wife knew, and if someone is going to prison, wouldn't they come forward?
Well, all these great questions. I'm not sure at what point Mel, as Keli says, Andrew told her the name was of the partner. I don't know at what point she was informed of the pregnancy. So that's obviously something that we can't confirm. This is all kind of hypothetical out there. So would you come forward? You would think so, wouldn't you? Were they fearful that they were involved in something illegal with some sort of illegal adoption? I mean, people have asked me that. It's like, well, he would have had to adopt her. Well, not if he's the biological father. I don't think people would have thought anything of the fact that if this situation had been reversed, that the biological father says to the mother, you take full custody, and everyone starts going, well, you'd had to have adopted her. No, you wouldn't. You're the biological mother. But because it's the father, people seem to struggle more with him wanting to take on that child. And I think that's just a cultural thing, actually.
Okay.
But so we don't know when Mel actually found out. And would you come forward? I mean, but are you going to have to give up that child at that point? And did they leave the country? Are there all sorts of other reasons why they may have heard nothing about this? I mean, you would think that you'd have to have literally been living under a rock to be in Australia and not know about the Keli Lane case. But I talk to people all the time and I mention these really high profile cases and people go, I'm sorry, who? And I'm like, where have you been? Like, where were you during this court case when it was on the news every single day? And it's been back in the media and back in the media since 2010 when Keli was found guilty of murder. And yet people don't know. They haven't seen it. So did they not come forward because they didn't want to get involved? Did they not come forward because they don't even know what happened? I don't know.
This is one of those cases that just has so many questions. Did the Crown have an idea? Did they paint a picture about how Keli would have or could have murdered her daughter?
Well, again, that is a very contested point because Mark Tedeschi, who was the DPP Crown prosecutor on this case, very senior barrister, very accomplished, loved cases that are unwinnable. So he was also responsible for Kath Folbig's conviction, and I will just leave that sitting there as a very heavy weight.
Yep.
Basically, in front of the jury, Tedeschi suggested that Keli could have killed Tegan and disposed of her at the building site of the new Olympics, because this is coming up, the 2000 Olympics. And so that was put out there as a possibility. He was then made to retract that because there was zero evidence that that was the case. And so the jury were told to ignore that hypothesis. And then obviously the jury are told to ignore that. But the problem is, we know from looking at the way juries work, if a jury is actually told to discount a remark that's been made, it actually imprints it on their brain. It makes it more important in their memory than it was originally. So what he had done by dropping that little bomb in there was give them a mechanism by which it could have been possible. The fact that there was no evidence for it didn't really matter in terms of his case. He'd given that to them. And so that was something that I believe was heavily influential, even though the jury were told to discount.
That's so interesting. I hadn't even thought of that. It's a criminal procedure that's used in trials, but the jury are human. You can't just discount something and like take it out of your brain and put it in the bin.
No, and imagine somebody goes to you, oh, so you just heard that. Now, that's so important that I want you to ignore it.
Yeah.
That's basically what he said. It's like that. You shouldn't have heard that. Alarm, alarm, red flag, right? Now, how do you then just wipe that from your mind? You can't. So it just kind of sits there festering away as a possibility. You can't suck it back out of the world.
Was there anything else that struck you about the investigation? Then there's a coronial inquest and now the trial, which we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But was there anything else that struck you about that process and perhaps the things that you kind of have alarm bells about now?
I think there were certainly avenues of investigation that were not followed up. Again, I think it took a really long time for the police to consider that Keli could have murdered Tegan. So much of that information that could have been captured in those early days was lost. And I think that was very detrimental later on. And I think that certainly by the time we got to trial, we're definitely in that cultural place where a woman has been accused of just about the worst thing that the community can see, that a woman can be accused of harming their own child. And when you look at that through the lens of the multiple abortions, the multiple births and adoptions, I think it was really easy by the time they got to the trial for everybody pretty much to have judged her on the basis of all of that. And then the lies came out. And this to me was always problematic because firstly, as I said, the behavioural issues, like the behavioural pattern didn't work. And so there was no psychological reason for her to have done this. And so it can be easy for people to get caught up in an emotional roller coaster. And they do when children are harmed. They are very emotive cases, allegedly when children have been harmed or even murdered. My background is as a forensic scientist. So I've always been taught to step back from that and only look at the facts and the evidence. And what does that tell us? And the facts and evidence here are that there's no body, clearly. You know, this is a no body case. It's a very infamous one. There's no forensic evidence that any crime has ever been committed, let alone murder. There's no witnesses to any crime. All of Keli's friends said when they'd seen her with children, she's great with kids. I mean, she went on to be a teacher. Kids loved her, right? And even after the police were investigating her, she's still babysitting for her friends. So none of her friends have any kind of concerns of any kind of issues with children. And there's no motive. And so when you look at all of that, strip back that emotion that comes with somebody who has allegedly harmed a child, no witness, no evidence, no body, no motive. So what is there? There's a missing child. That was the basis on which she was found guilty. We don't know what happened to Tegan. I've never seen a case like it.
I know I'm part of the media, but is the media to blame? Does the media need to take something away from this? Because this isn't a story that was a tiny little insert in the paper. This was wall-to-wall coverage.
I'm not sure the media is strictly to blame, because I think the community is also choosing to consume certain types of media, right? So I think it's easy to blame the media and say, oh, we're all taken up by the way media presents a story. And certainly there's an element of that. The media outlets have a choice to make about what they're putting on, the coverage they're giving it. I mean, I'm making zero commentary about this case, but look at what is happening with the defamation case of Learman currently, ongoing. What a mess, right? But the media, certain media outlets are choosing to present that in different ways, depending on their perspectives and competition across the networks, right? Mm-hmm. So certainly the media has an agenda. There's no denying that with a story. But there's also, we have a choice of what we listen to, what we watch. We can be thoughtful human beings and not just accept everything that is presented to us by the media blindly. So we are still adults who can still process information and make objective choices.
I do want to give people the benefit of the doubt, though, because like you said with the jury being forced to forget about a certain point, when certain headlines say someone is a psycho mum or they use phrases that kind of stick in your head, and with Keli, it would have been about jumping on all those white lies and putting her up as a liar and all those kinds of language tools. It does kind of sink into people's brains.
I think she was painted as cold, more than crazy. This was a cold-hearted woman who could have abortions, she could give up for adoptions, and this was obviously having no impact on her emotionally. Well, that isn't the Keli that I met. It isn't. But that's the point, isn't it? The stories that are on the television, they don't really reflect the real person necessarily. And the viewers and the listeners don't get to meet that person. And Keli, under advisement, didn't give evidence in her defence. And obviously everyone has the right to remain silent and not speak in their defence. And that was obviously what her defence counsel thought was best for her. And that's quite common, because if you give a statement in court, you can then be cross-examined. And that can open up a whole can of worms. So many people don't speak in their defense. Some people would think that that is suspicious. Well, why wouldn't they defend themselves? But it's often the best course of action for accused persons. They will take their counsel's advice, obviously. That's what the counsel is there for. However, I think if Keli had spoken in court, she's very intelligent, she's very articulate. She would have expressed, I think, more emotion than she did walking in and out of court. And you remember the images of her crossing that press gallery every day, just trying to hold it together, right?
You're right. She looked cold because we didn't hear from her.
It looked cold because we didn't hear her voice. And I think had she spoken, I think that was a big mistake by the defence, actually, that she didn't have her voice. And I think now, whenever Keli is released, she's still incarcerated at this time, then she will still maintain her innocence. She will still fight to have her name cleared. And she wants to have her voice because she gave up that opportunity during the trial under advisement. And now I think she thinks that that was a mistake.
By the time Keli was convicted, she was found guilty of murdering Tegan in 2011. She was given 18 years with a non-parole of 13 years. Were you surprised when that result came through?
So I think looking back at how Anthony Wheely, who was the judge in that case, actually passed down that sentence, I think he's always had concerns about the reliability. I don't think he ever felt that the conclusion was reached beyond reasonable doubt, but he's obviously bound by the jury's decision. And I think he took into account all of those mitigating factors at sentencing. So 18 years is basically the minimum he could give her, 18 years maximum term with a 13 and a half years minimum where she would be eligible for parole. And so we are talking about a murder charge. There are sentencing guidelines, and whilst judges do have discretion within that to look at both exacerbating features for sentencing and mitigating, so things that would make the sentence at the lower end or the higher end, depending on the particular circumstances of that crime, I think he gave her the minimum terms that he could.
At what point did you meet her? Because we've ascertained that you have a relationship with her. How did that come about?
So when my book came out, I'd raised concerns about this case for all the reasons I've mentioned, no body, no witness, no evidence, no motive. And Keli contacted me and asked if I would be willing to speak with her. And I said yes. And so I visited her in Silverwater a number of times. And I did a piece with 60 Minutes a few years ago with Ali Langdon.
Do you think the woman you've met is capable of killing?
I've met a lot of different people in a lot of circumstances as a forensic criminologist, and I'm not a naive person. I'm pretty sceptical. And no, I don't think she could. Not intentionally. I don't think she would intentionally harm a baby.
Met her parents and I know her partner. So I would say my relationship is very much professional. However, I am not an advocate for Keli. I simply speak what I think to be the facts of the case. I raise issues around what I think are some of the problems. Whether I think Keli is, quote, innocent or not isn't the point. And I've never publicly commented on that because I think my position is one of an objective observer of facts. And so if I start saying, well, I think she did it or I think she didn't do it, that isn't really relevant to my point. My point is there evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Tegan Lane has been murdered by Keli Lane? And the answer is no.
You've said you've visited her a few times. What do you guys talk about? Are you talking about her appeals and when she's going to get out, if she's going to get out, all of that kind of stuff?
All of that, trying to look at more options for potentially finding Tegan, finding potentially more Andrew Norris Morrises who haven't been previously identified. I visited Keli with one of her representatives from RMIT's Innocence Initiative. Dr. Michelle Reuters runs that. And she's worked with Keli for many years now, trying to progress her case. She's still very heavily involved with that. So, yeah, we talk about all of that. Getting a better likeness of Andrew Norris, for example. What are the options? Where's the information? How to progress the case? So, yes, we talk about all of that. And she's always very consistent in her story. I don't get the sense that I've necessarily heard the truth of all of it. I think Keli is still very secretive. However, she is very sure of parts of the story of what happened, and I believe she is telling her truth, even though I don't believe it's necessarily the entire truth. But again, this is a woman's life who has been raped over since 2010, and she was found guilty. So is she still keeping secrets? Yes, I think she is. But is she entitled to keep secrets given her whole family life and all of these things she desperately wanted to keep hidden are splashed all over the media? Well, yeah, I think she is. So if she's not telling me everything, then what obligation does she have to do so?
How's she doing in prison?
So it's very difficult for her at the moment because I'm sure we'll get to this, but her parole was recently refused a couple of weeks ago. And so her period of parole is up in May. And so she would have served her 13 and a half years. She's been on day release. And so we were expectant that she would be released after 13 and a half, a minimum term, because she's basically been the model inmate. She's worked with others on diet and exercise regime. She's really done everything she can to improve the lives of her fellow females she's been incarcerated with. And she hasn't done that, I don't think, for brownie points. She could have just sat through her 13 and a half years and just not caused any trouble and therefore met her minimum parole period. But Keli is somebody who ultimately likes helping people and working with people. She's a very people-centric person. She's got great social skills, communication skills. And so I think she's generally done things whilst being inside that have helped her and that have helped other people to get through that time. But now her parole has ultimately been rejected. I think it's going to be a very difficult time for her because it was rejected on the grounds that she was ineligible because she's not disclosed the location of Tegan's remains or body. And she's fallen under the new no body, no parole laws that were brought in. And so I think that is going to be particularly a huge psychological and emotional blow for Keli and her family and supporters because these laws are new. And had they not been in place, when she'd met the minimum parole period, I have no doubt she would have been released in May.
Let's touch on those laws because the reason most people will have heard of them was because of the Chris Dawson case. They came in at that time when he was being sentenced because Lynette Dawson's body was never found. What are your concerns with those laws? They are so fresh. we're just seeing them being used now.
Yeah, they are very fresh. And as you say, they were brought in really in the wake of Chris Dawson because changes were made to the legislation to suggest that, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it basically says that if an offender is to be eligible for parole, they have to have basically satisfied the authorities that they've done everything they can to assist them with the location of the victim's body or remains. If they don't do that, they are ineligible for parole. And so this is really to incentivize people to obviously disclose the victim's location. And so with Chris Dawson, he's been found guilty of murdering his wife, Lynette, 40 odd years ago. And so it was brought in, to my mind, almost as a knee-jerk reaction to cases, high-profile cases of that nature. And so the issue with this is if somebody cannot disclose the location of remains, Keli has always maintained her innocence, you'll note. If you cannot, therefore, disclose where the victim's remains or body is because there is no remains, you generally don't have that information, you get caught up in this. And there's no evidence that these laws actually do incentivize people, certainly not going to impact Chris Dawson. He is an elderly man who's received a very significant term for murder, so he's never going to be eligible for parole. Unless something really unusual happens at appeal that I'm not expecting, then Chris Dawson is going to die in prison. And so the reasons these laws were brought in are not going to impact the people that they were brought actually into effect. And so I think Keli's been caught up in that. And my bigger issue with this is that these laws are brought in to help the families, right? So in Chris Dawson's case, it's to help Lynette's family. Lynette's family is still desperate to know where she is. They want Lynette home. They want to bury her or do whatever rights suits their family. And families really suffer with that when they don't have remains to give those rights to. And so the law has been brought in to help those families. But in Keli's case, Tegan is Keli's daughter. So obviously Keli's family remains very supportive of Keli, supportive of her innocence. And so who is it serving to keep her in prison under these no body, no parole laws? Is it in fact serving the family of the missing child, Tegan? No, because it's the same family. So you're almost punishing that family again by not releasing Tegan, who believe Keli is not guilty of murder. And so I think these laws are highly problematic. I think they're far too blunt. The language is far too strong in that you can't blindly apply these things in all scenarios. There will always be times when you need wiggle room, but the law as it stands, the legislation provides no wiggle room. There's nowhere to go with it. So unfortunately, when the hearing outcome was announced, I knew that it was going to be a negative because the parole board had nowhere to go.
Do these laws change as we see how they work? Is that how these processes go?
Yeah, they do. And we've seen these kind of changes as a result of the Chris Dawson case. And my problem, I suppose, when we start changing laws in reaction to one case, it can be quite politicized. And so this is seen as kind of the right thing to do. But often we don't acknowledge that there will be other outcomes that we're not predicting. It will get other people will get caught up in it we're not seeing. This legislation was never changed to impact Keli's case. So I think that it's the first really high profile one that has got caught up in it. There's only a handful in New South Wales that are ever going to fall under this. And so I just think that it needs review. We need to look at the wording of that. Sometimes it may be appropriate that these no body, no parole laws are brought in. In other circumstances, I think that we need some maneuverability around this, because I just think that we know miscarriages of justice occur, right? Kathleen Folbig is now poster child for miscarriages of justice. Many people believe for a very long time she'd murdered her 4 children. I bet if you did a poll, some people would still believe that she killed those children, because there are some diehards out there who will not accept the science no matter what it says. And so we know there's no denying miscarriages happen. If Keli is a miscarriage of justice, I believe she is, because I don't think the evidence exists. And so for her to get caught up in this after spending so long incarcerated, away from her daughter, she's a mother. She needs to get home to her daughter. And I just think that these laws are preventing that. And I think that's a real shame. I think the other point about no body, no parole is not meant to be a punitive factor. Okay, so when Anthony Whealy set down that full term of 18 years, a minimum term of 13 and a half years. He took all of the mitigating factors and everything else into account when he sentenced, right? Now, you have to remember he always had his doubts over whether she was guilty or not, but in his sentencing guidelines, if somebody hasn't, quote, shown remorse because they haven't disclosed where their victim's body is, that is one of the circumstances which is called an aggravating factor, okay? So he's considered all of that in his sentencing. So now you look forward and Keli's done her minimum term, and now the law says, well, if you now don't jump through this other hoop, you still don't get parole, even though the fact that you hadn't disclosed the remains was considered at sentencing. You've already been punished for that in your length of sentence. We're now going to keep you inside even longer to further punish you. Now, parole is actually there so that when somebody is released on parole, it's meant to help reintegrate them into the community, because we all want people to come out of prison, which is a very hard thing to do, to become a pro-social member of society, to fit back in, to lead a positive life going forward. And parole is there to help monitor people and assist them to do that, right? So it's not literally a get out of jail free card. It's a period of transition. It is not a further punishment. But now with this no parole laws, it's like, well, we already considered that at sentencing, but we haven't got what we want, so we're going to punish you more by keeping you in prison longer. And that is not the purpose of parole, and I think it's an aberration of that process.
So what do you think her future honestly looks like? Do you think she's just going to have to serve another 5 years?
Another 4.5 years, yeah, because unless she can disclose Tegan's whereabouts to the satisfaction of New South Wales Police, then they write a letter to the parole board saying she has satisfied this condition, she's done everything she can to disclose the victim's location, then the parole board can't do anything. So they will keep having their hearings. You know, they still go through process, but the outcome, sadly, will be the same unless something legally weird happens. And I've spoken to lots of colleagues at work. I'm fortunate in the University of Newcastle. I work in a school that's criminology and lawyers. So we've had many discussions about this. And we looked at it coming up to the parole hearing, and they were saying there's no way around this. So whilst things stay the same as they are, while that legislation is worded the way it is, then my understanding from my law colleagues is that she will remain in prison till she has completed her full sentence.
You've written a lot about mothers who murder. We've spoken about Kathleen Folbig, the fact that she got out. We haven't touched on, but Lindy Chamberlain is also a miscarriage of justice.
Absolutely. She was the first poster
child.
She
was the first poster child. Do you think it's women that get caught up in this? Why is it so different when dads kill? When mums kill, there seems to be a much more visceral reaction from society.
Absolutely. The whole reason I started writing the book was I came across Kath Folbig's case and some of the expert commentary that had come out of the UK that was still influential in that case. And the whole trigger for the book was that. But then I went back and I found the case of Lindy Chamberlain. And honestly, I could not believe we were still having these conversations about, these cold-hearted women. They were all painted in the same way, they were emotionless, they were cold. And I remember thinking when I looked at some videos of both Lindy and Kath and Keli actually going into court, that if I had been accused of something serious, I would have acted exactly the same. Like there wouldn't be any tears. On the outside, it would be like stone. That's how I would handle my emotions, right? And I think it's easy to judge what's going on the outside, but that has no reflection of what's happening on the inside at all. Like people would often think that, I'm very calm doing something and it could be all like going crazy on the inside, but you would never know on the outside. And I think that when a woman looks cold and together, it can be really easy to judge her because we're the nurturers, right? We all love children. Not me. I don't have any. I'm very happy to let everyone else do that. And so, but there's certain expectations on you as a female to behave in a certain way. And when you break that tradition, that social expectation, and it's often women that respond really viscerally to this, there's almost no punishment that is too serious. Hang, draw and quarter these women. But when men do it, it's almost like, well, men can be violent. We expect that. What do women do to protect themselves from male violence? Because, males just can't help themselves, right? Yeah, right. But when a woman does it, it's like, oh, well, she's obviously evil, and they paint this picture almost like this witch. And I just think that we're still doing it. I mean, when some women ask me, oh, do you have children? I say no. And they go, oh, I go, no, it's actually fine. It's a choice. And then they go, like, what is wrong with you? That's the other face I get when you say you don't want them, because it's like this automatic where you should love children. Men don't do that. I think mostly it's women projecting this onto other women, that if you're not a nurturer, there's something wrong with you. And I think we have to break down that narrative, because I think all three of these women were prosecuted under that fallacy: Lindy, Kath, and Keli, and probably many others.
Thanks to Xanthi for helping us tell Keli's story. Xanthi recently did an episode about this case on her podcast Motive and Method. If you'd like to hear that, you can find it linked in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Sandy McIntyre, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. You can leave a review on your favourite podcast app, and it helps us make it into the charts so that other true crime fans can find our work. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation. Next week on the podcast, I'll be joined by former Crown Prosecutor Margaret Caneen SC, who will share her insights on leading the prosecution of the notorious 2000 Scaff gang rapes, as well as her experiences handling numerous high-profile cases throughout her career, first as a prosecutor and now as a criminal defence barrister. In the meantime, if you're looking for more to listen to, at the end of last year, I had a compelling conversation with journalist Richard Baker about one of Australia's longest-running cults, the Geelong Revival Centre, and the chilling accounts from ex-members. You'll find a link to that episode in our show notes if you missed it. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back in your ears next week.